Good evening, I'm Diana Skaya, and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. 2 meetings, 3 delegations, and a push for peace between Ukraine and Russia. On Sunday, U.S. officials met with their Ukrainian counterparts. And on Monday, in the same place but without Ukraine, the American and Russian delegations will take their turn at the table. And more on that in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Massive attack on Kyiv. Russians launched nearly 150 drones targeting Ukraine's southwestern regions. And Turkey is in the heat of protests. Thousands take to the streets to defend democracy. And Pope Francis makes his first public appearance in 5 weeks. A pivotal moment for Ukraine-Russia peace talks, or just another round of stalled negotiations? Well, on Sunday, U.S. and Ukrainian delegations met in Saudi Arabia to resume talks on the ongoing war waged by Russia, followed by direct talks between Washington and Moscow on Monday. Now, U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, expressed optimism ahead of the talks, claiming Vladimir Putin wants peace. Let's now go live to our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Chatterjee, for the latest. Good evening, Oz. So, will these talks bring real progress? By April 20th, the date that Donald Trump reportedly says he wants this conflict resolved, or are we looking at another diplomatic standoff?
Well, look, I'll give you the perspective of the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government are certainly hopeful that some peace can be reached, some sort of ceasefire can be reached. That's the position, the official position of the government here. I've spent much time over the last few weeks talking to people on the streets, talking to politicians. There seems to be a general understanding that they are heading towards some sort of cessation of hostilities. However, my experience of covering the conflict has given me no indication that that is heading. Now, Steve Witkoff, he's supposed to be the envoy, Donald Trump's envoy for the Middle East. He seems to have replaced the envoy for Russia and Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, as the chief negotiator with Russia at these talks in Saudi Arabia. Keith Kellogg, nowhere to be seen at the moment. He certainly seems to think that Putin is a man of his word, and recent comments given by him in an interview with Tucker Carlson certainly won't be giving encouraging signs to Kyiv. But still, there seems to be this idea here that there is movement towards some sort of cessation of hostilities. Let's take a listen to what Steve Witkoff had to say about these discussions that happened on Sunday between a Ukrainian delegation and a US delegation.
I feel that he wants peace. The president had 2 very productive calls this week, or last week, I should say, one with President Zelensky, one with President Putin. I sat and listened to both of them. In both conversations, it was all about a lasting peace. Lots of progress got made last week. Now, I've been asked my opinion. So about what President Putin's motives are on a larger scale. And I simply have said that I just don't see that he wants to take all of Europe.
So Mr. Witkoff there saying that he's seen a lot of progress. Well, I haven't seen any evidence of that progress on the ground yet. If the US is hoping that there is further movement towards that, then they have a lot more work to go, given the way that strikes have been occurring between these 2 countries over the last few days. Now, Rustem Umerov, the country's defense minister, he also spoke about this meeting that took place on Sunday between US and Ukrainian representatives. Is a more technical meeting of experts to talk about technical specific points about a potential ceasefire proposal. Let's take a listen to what the defense minister had to say about those talks.
We've started the meeting with the American team in Riyadh. We are implementing the President of Ukraine's directive to bring a just peace closer and to strengthen security. The agenda includes proposals to protect energy facilities and critical infrastructure. Today, we are walking through a number of complex technical issues, Our delegation includes energy experts as well as military representatives from the naval and air components.
So the official line coming out of Kyiv is still hopeful that some sort of ceasefire with Russia can be agreed under the auspices of the Trump administration. Again, the reality on the ground is the war continues. People are continuing to die here in Ukraine, and there is currently no end in sight, despite these discussions that are taking place in Saudi Arabia at the moment. Back to you, Diana.
And the next 24 hours will be crucial in those discussions. Thank you, Oz Chatterjee, coming to us live from Kyiv. And staying on Ukraine, a massive Russian drone attack in Kyiv overnight killed at least 3 people, including a 5-year-old child, and forced dozens of residents to evacuate as fires broke out across the city. Now, as negotiations for a potential ceasefire do continue in Riyadh, Kyiv's residents are left wondering, will peace come in time to stop the relentless attacks, or is it just another cycle of violence? Piotr Miszczuk reports.
This is what a 9-story residential building in Kyiv's Dniprovsky district looks like now. In a night drone attack, 1 female resident was killed here.
She was about 80 years old, but she had not yet retired. The security company could not open the door to her apartment. The door got trapped and she burned alive in there. It's horrible, but that is what war is.
In total, 3 people were killed overnight, including a 5-year-old child. A number of people were injured.
We woke up because of the explosion. I don't know how it happened, but I ended up lying by the window. Bright flashes. We turned on the light and all the windows were shattered. It happened so fast.
The airstrike triggered the evacuation of many residents, which was particularly difficult for the elderly.
Yesterday was fast and scary. My elderly mother was here. It was very hard for her. The ambulance came, everybody else came and helped. But it's hard for an older woman to go through that.
The incessant strikes have driven many to the edge. Now everything many of them wish for is a ceasefire.
I would like them to finally reach some kind of agreement. They will continue to travel and talk for quite some time. I'm talking about all sides of the conflict. While ordinary people, ordinary Ukrainians, ordinary children will suffer. So I would like to see the talks come to a logical conclusion, at least to end the strikes.
But others do not believe that a real armistice is possible.
I do not believe in a total ceasefire. I do not believe in total safety, because we have seen what our bad neighbor is capable of.
And the ceasefire might not be so far off. With the negotiations in Riyadh hoped to bring some tangible outcomes as early as April.
Hungary remains a roadblock on Ukraine's path to the European Union, with Budapest citing concerns over minority rights as its primary justification. Now, as tensions simmer between the 2 neighbors, the issue has become another flashpoint in Hungary's increasingly strained relationship with Brussels. Sonia Gata-Biszczan has the details in this next report.
Hungary's foreign minister once again opposed Ukraine's bid for European Union membership. Peter Szijjártó argues that Kyiv's alleged curbing of the rights of Hungarians in the Ukrainian region of Transcarpathia is a deal-breaker.
Despite the promises, Ukraine still hasn't restored the Hungarian minority rights taken away in 2015. Until that changes, there can be no progress on EU accession, as Kyiv's minority policy remains unacceptable.
In 2017, Ukraine made the Ukrainian language mandatory in public schools. While aimed at bolstering national identity, the development raised some concerns over minority language protections, including Hungarian. However, Kyiv promptly met with Budapest to reconcile the situation.
They made an agreement, but later on Budapest stepped back from that, because in that way they can still use as a pretext that case to block any movement which makes Ukraine closer to EU.
Most recently, EU leaders rejected Vladimir Putin's request to halt military aid to Ukraine as part of the ongoing ceasefire negotiations. All except one, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban.
It's simply anti-European when one person blocks decisions that are important for the entire continent or that have already been agreed upon.
Frictions in Transcarpathia worsened when Orban's government gave passports to the ethnic Hungarian community in the region, despite Kyiv's ban on dual citizenship. In 2018, the Hungarian consul toasted new passport holders, saying, quote, "Don't tell the Ukrainian authorities."
So the Hungarian government unfortunately used the Hungarian minority case to block any Ukrainian initiative, and Hungary became the Trojan horse of Putin in the EU.
Although Hungary did not endorse military support for Ukraine at the Brussels Emergency Summit, the leaders of the remaining 26 EU countries published their own conclusions independently of Hungary. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gatabishan.
The Prince of Wales traveled to Estonia to reaffirm the UK's commitment to NATO's eastern flank and support British troops stationed there. Now, on Friday, he had met with Estonia's president and visited military sites where UK forces are deployed as part of NATO's largest overseas operation. Now, Prince William's visit comes as Estonia announced that it would spend at least 5% of its GDP on defense, thus reinforcing deterrence along the alliance's eastern border. Zuzana Jurek reports.
British Prince William embarked on a tour of Estonia this past week. Apart from the expected public engagements, including an audience with Estonia's President Alar Karis, he also met with UK troops. They are stationed in the Baltic state as one of the several battle groups established by NATO to enhance its military footprint in the eastern part of the alliance.
When you have such a senior level royal visiting, I think it serves to both reiterate and reinforce the sovereignty of a small country like Estonia.
Following the signing of the British-Estonian bilateral defence roadmap in October last year, the UK took on the role as a, quote, framework nation, providing reinforcements and leading joint military exercises of the NATO troops brigades.
Three Baltic states are dealing with one of the most difficult threats coming from Russia. One threat, but highly divided, because Russia is putting a pressure on the military, political, economical field against NATO members and European Union members.
Estonia is determined to bolster its military capabilities. Just this week, it pledged to increase defense spending to 5% starting in 2026, an addition of approximately 600 million euros for the military budget. This commitment mirrors those already seen from Estonia's neighbours, including Poland, which is expected to reach 4.7% of GDP spending on defense in 2025.
Everyone is also convinced that Europe has to take on more responsibility and start bearing the burdens associated with building a defense industry. Increased aid for Ukraine during the war and greater spending within NATO on defense budgets.
In recent days, it's not just defense but deterrence of adversaries which has dominated the region's agenda.
A recommendation by the defense ministers of 4 countries, Poland and the Baltic states, are all in the same direction, deciding that we should leave the Ottawa Convention,
which experts point out serves as a necessary precaution for an increasingly precarious neighborhood.
Landmines and even the more holistic picture of mines is the key element in that response to Russian potential threat against our sovereignty and against our territory.
For these smaller states, they, in this Helsinki versus Yalta worldview where the rights of smaller states don't make it, they are going to make it as impossible and as difficult for the adversaries to come over the border.
All of these efforts aim to boost the region's preparedness in the face of uncertainty of old alliances. For TVP World, Zuzana Jurek.
And now what you're seeing on screen are live images coming out of Istanbul in Turkey. Live escalating political crisis, another day of protests. With each passing day over the past week, more and more people are taking part in massive demonstrations. What we're seeing now are tens of thousands of demonstrators who came out. What's going on is an escalating political crisis in Turkey. Earlier today, the court has formally arrested Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu on corruption charges. That is today, Sunday, placing him in pre-trial detention just as he was poised to secure his party's presidential nomination. Now, his detention also sparked Turkey's largest protest in over a decade, among them what we're seeing right now. And over the weekend, authorities actually took it to detain hundreds of those protesters. Now we have a report that our reporter, Aisha Abache, prepared.
A convoy of vehicles escorted Istanbul's mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu to Silivri prison, located just outside the city, following his formal arrest for corruption on Sunday, shortly after the Turkish Interior Ministry suspended him from office.
Ekrem İmamoğlu is currently on his way to prison, but he's also on his way to the presidency.
The leader of the opposition Republican People's Party, Özgür Özel, made the statement after casting his vote in a primary election aimed at selecting the imprisoned İmamoğlu as the party's candidate for the 2028 presidential election.
Today we're here to support Ekrem İmamoğlu, our Mayor Ekrem, who has been subjected to injustice, lawlessness, whose equality and rights have been destroyed.
İmamoğlu took Istanbul. Whoever takes Istanbul takes Turkey. This has always been said. With these accusations, the aim is to defeat Ekrem İmamoğlu and reduce his power.
The political struggle started when İmamoğlu, the strongest rival to Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, was detained on Wednesday on terrorism and corruption charges. Despite the ban on public gatherings, the move has sparked some of the largest protests Turkey's seen in more than a decade.
We see that he is very popular in Turkey. He is also not only popular by the supporters of the CHP, he is also popular among conservative people, for example, who used to be vote for Erdogan. He could become an integrative figure of Turkish political system.
Erdogan's response to the protests has been uncompromising.
The days when politics and justice were directed through street terrorism are a thing of the past with the old Turkey.
Characterized by a heavy police presence and frequent use of force against demonstrators. The former mayor firmly denied the allegations.
The ongoing judicial process is far from being fair. It's an execution without trial.
The day before his detention, İmamoğlu was stripped of his university degree, which formally prevents him from running for the presidency. But it's not the first time that his political appeal has been challenged. In 2019, when İmamoğlu won the election for mayor of Istanbul for the first time, Turkish authorities challenged the results and the election was annulled. He retook office a month later with a landslide win in the repeat election. For Erdogan, the loss of Istanbul, where his political career began in the 1990s, was a personal blow.
After weeks of concern and prayers from millions around the world, Pope Francis has returned to the Vatican. Now, though still frail, the 88-year-old pontiff made sure to share a heartfelt moment with those who had been eagerly waiting for his recovery. Sasha Farbach has the story.
After 37 days of worry and uncertainty, Pope Francis, the leader of over 1 billion Catholics, made his long-awaited first public appearance. On Sunday, the Pope was discharged from Gemelli Hospital and brought back to the Vatican for further rest. Despite still feeling weak, he took a moment to address the anxious crowd, sharing a heartfelt message with one individual in particular.
Thank you all, and I see this lady with the yellow flowers. She's good.
The 88-year-old pontiff's words were warmly received by Carmela Vittoria Mancuso, who has prayed for him daily since the start of his illness, often in the clinic's chapel, alongside millions of others, keeping him in their thoughts.
I do it because I feel united with all the others, and there is that communion with everyone. And then we feel his presence there every time he tells us to pray for him.
On February 14th, Pope Francis was hospitalized at the Gemelli Clinic in Rome with a severe respiratory infection, requiring a series of changing treatments, sparking widespread concern. Staying true to his papacy, he openly shared frequent and often vivid updates on his health.
That is kind of like a signal. That's kind of like something that, we could have easily not mentioned, But the detail of it was sort of saying like, this happens to me too. So in a way, he was also, talking to other sick people who were saying, if I'm going through it just the way you would as well.
Pope Francis is no longer in imminent danger, but his doctors have recommended more than 2 months of convalescence at the Vatican. Pope, known for his warm personality and deep connection with people, will face new challenges during this period of rest.
He still, is susceptible to infections, etc., viruses, etc. So he's going to have to be, he's not going to be able to, to talk to people, see people as much as before. And that, I think, will pain him.
Pope Francis, who has led the world's Catholics for 12 years, continues to inspire with a spirit that remains undimmed by his aging health. As he now rests at the Vatican for recovery, many around the globe today will take comfort knowing their pontiff is at last out of the hospital. Sasha Farbach, TVP World.
The world is watching closely as U.S. and Ukrainian officials are meeting in Saudi Arabia to discuss peace talks, part of President Trump's latest push to end 3 years of war in Ukraine. Now, this meeting comes just ahead of crucial U.S.-Russia talks set for Monday. But the question is, will diplomacy make a breakthrough or hit another dead end? And joining me now to break it all down is Kurt Volker, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, who was also the former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Kurt, welcome to the program. So happy to have you here with us on World Talks this evening.
On World News. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So, Kurt, Ukraine is currently holding talks with the United States in Riyadh. Bloomberg reports that the White House is aiming to reach an agreement between Russia and Ukraine before April 20th. What key takeaways can we expect discussions to center on today and tomorrow, Monday? What are the key objectives here?
Well, I think there's two categories of things. The first is an immediate ceasefire. There was, in principle, agreement to a ceasefire as it relates to targeting energy infrastructure. And then the idea was to expand that to include maritime domain and then possibly the full air domain, and then possibly a full ceasefire. So that's the first set of topics, is can we actually agree on a ceasefire so people stop the killing? And that, I think, that April 20th target that you mentioned, that's conceivable, that you could possibly get there. What's going to happen, though, is Russia is going to demand other things. They're going to say, we need to have a commitment that Ukraine will never be in NATO. We need to have a ban on further armament of Ukraine. We need to have no more mobilization in Ukraine. We need to have Ukraine give up more territory, even than what Russia already occupies. So we have all these demands coming from Russia, and they're going to portray that as necessary in order to have a ceasefire. So they don't want just a ceasefire now. They want a final settlement, and they want that final settlement to reflect their maximist views. So that's what I think we're going to run into. I hope the American side there is able to push back on these absolutist views of Russia, say, no, that's not going to happen, but let's get started. Let's start with the ceasefire and let's continue talks.
Chris, let me interrupt you right there. You've mentioned those important points, but now, you're saying that Russia is going to demand more. Do you think that Trump is making major concessions to Putin?
No reason to think that right now. There's nothing that he has said or that anyone else has said that we are agreeing with Putin on these things. What I see happening is Putin, quite predictably, making all of these demands, and the U.S. wanting to keep engaging him because they need to get Russia to agree to a ceasefire and to agree to stop the fighting. So they're engaging him. But so far, there's no indication of any agreement on these absolutist demands.
And just, very briefly with this topic, do you personally think that we can actually see a breakthrough in negotiations this time around?
Well, again, I would separate these into two categories. I think in the idea of a ceasefire, yes, I think that we can actually get a ceasefire. And part of the reason for that is Putin's own economy and his own military effort are not as strong as he wants us to believe. So he actually needs a ceasefire too. So I think that's possible. When it comes to a full-scale agreement, however, I really am very skeptical that we will ever have one. Putin's demands are too much, and neither Ukrainians nor Europe nor even Americans could agree to those demands. And as a result, we end up with a situation where we have a ceasefire, no active fighting, and all we can do then is deter future Russian attacks, try to prevent them, because we're not going to be able to have a full agreement.
Kurt, let me ask you this. I mean, you were former U.S. ambassador to NATO. There are currently massive protests, massive demonstrations taking place in Turkey, in Istanbul. What can you tell us about, the arrest of Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu on corruption charges on Sunday? I mean, what do you think is going to take shape in Turkey? How will this all unfold?
Well, it's really too early to say. You have these massive protests in Istanbul in support of the mayor. You will likely see the AK Party organize counter-protests, probably in Istanbul or elsewhere in the country, maybe or Ankara or elsewhere in the country, maybe also in Istanbul. And I think the government's case against the mayor is probably very weak, and in which case I think these protests will just expand. But if they come forward with hard evidence that he has committed corruption, I think they can blunt the impact of the protests. But I'm skeptical. I think we're going to see this go on for some time.
So, I mean, are these protesters going to be able to actually make changes?
I wouldn't say that they're going to cause Erdogan to step down or to cause a change in the government, but it can cause a change in the sentiment of the population. So there will be a point in the future where Turkey has another election where you have to look beyond Erdogan's current term of office. And if the sentiment sticks that the AK Party has gone too far now, that could result in change down the road.
I mean, Kurt, what we're seeing there on the screens right now is current live images of the protests taking place in Istanbul, in Turkey. I mean, these are really one of the biggest protests that are taking place in Turkey, that have taken place in Turkey in the past decade. Let me just ask you this related to that. What about the other people that have been arrested? I mean, we have hundreds of people that were arrested over the weekend from Friday on to Saturday. What happens to them?
Well, what I suspect the government wants to do, and again, it's too early to say how this all plays out. They want to let these protests die out a little bit, and then they would probably release those people who were arrested other than the mayor himself. And I think in the case of the mayor, if they really became concerned that these protests threaten the stability of the government in the country, they could even make some concessions to him just as a way to diffuse these protests. But I doubt that they're going to do that. I think they're going to just play this out for a while.
And I mean, what does Erdogan really want here?
I think he wants to prevent İmamoğlu or an opposition figure like that from presenting a serious challenge to the AK Party, either his presidency or the AK Party government in the future and as they look at elections a couple of years from now. So he's trying to make that a weaker force. At this stage, it looks like it is having the opposite effect. It is having the effect of cementing that opposition view. But again, we have to remember Turkey is more than just Istanbul. You have the vast majority of these protesters in Istanbul are all in support of the mayor, but you have a vast number of people outside the country who are skeptical and very strongly support the AK Party. So I think we won't see the government reacting completely against or completely because of these protesters. They're going to watch that, but they're going to keep the broader country in mind as well.
Kurt, in under 30 seconds, is what's happening in Turkey, do you believe that it's going to shift possibly the relationship that Turkey has with the United States and the West?
Well, for different reasons, I think that relationship is going to shift. The Turkish success in Syria and the ability now to work with the U.S. in Syria, the peace agreement with Öcalan and the PKK, which will allow them to work with the U.S. on Kurdish issues as well as their potential role in Ukraine if there's a peace settlement. I think all of these things are going to bring the U.S. and Turkey closer.
And again, we're hearing those protesters loud and about in Istanbul. Thank you so much, Kurt Volker, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, for being with us here this evening on TVP World.
Thank you.
And that completes this edition of World News Tonight. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.